The dimly lit bar buzzed with conversation and laughter as people enjoyed their evening. In the corner, Jason Statham sat alone, casually sipping his drink, blending in with the crowd. He was not looking for trouble, just a quiet night out. But trouble had a way of finding him. A loud voice cut through the chatter. A burly man at the bar was taunting another patron, shoving him slightly, his aggressive tone making it clear he was looking for dominance. The atmosphere shifted. People grew tense, eyes darting toward the commotion, but no one dared to intervene. Jason watched silently, his sharp eyes analyzing the situation. He had seen this type before, bullies who thrived on fear. The question was not if he would act, but when. Little did anyone know, they were about to witness something unforgettable. The bar was lively, filled with people unwinding after a long day. It was a popular spot in the city, known for its rustic charm, dim lighting, and classic rock music playing softly in the background. Friends gathered at tables, sharing drinks and laughter, while the bartender skillfully mixed cocktails behind the polished wooden counter. The atmosphere was warm and welcoming, a place where people could relax and enjoy themselves. Among the patrons was Jason Statham, sitting alone at the corner of the bar. He was dressed casually in a dark leather jacket and jeans, blending in with the crowd. He sipped his drink calmly, observing the room with his sharp eyes. He was not looking for trouble, but trouble often had a way of finding him. At a nearby table, a different scene was unfolding. A loud, arrogant man named Greg was making his presence known. He was a big guy with a muscular build, and he loved being the center of attention. His booming voice overpowered the conversations around him, and his aggressive manner made several patrons uncomfortable. His focus, however, was on a young man named Eric, who sat a few seats away. Eric was a quiet, reserved individual, much smaller in size compared to Greg. He had been enjoying his drink in peace until Greg decided to make him a target. "Look at this guy," Greg laughed, nudging his friends. "Sitting here all alone, looking miserable. Maybe if you hit the gym once in a while, you would not look so weak." Eric tried to ignore the comment, but Greg was not the type to back off easily. He continued to throw insults, making jokes at Eric's expense. The people around them watched but did not intervene. Some looked uncomfortable, while others simply avoided getting involved. Jason, however, saw everything. He could tell that Eric was not going to stand up for himself, and the situation was only getting worse. Greg was growing bolder, and if nobody stopped him, things could take a bad turn. Jason set his glass down and took a deep breath. He knew what he had to do. The tension in the bar was rising, and Jason was ready to step in. Greg leaned in closer to Eric, his grin widening as he enjoyed the discomfort he was causing. He slapped the table hard, making the drinks shake. "Come on, man, say something. Or are you too scared?" he taunted, his voice loud enough for everyone in the bar to hear. Eric clenched his jaw but remained silent, clearly hoping that ignoring Greg would make him lose interest. But Greg was not finished. He grabbed Eric's glass and took a sip. "Ugh, what is this? A kid's drink? No wonder you look like that," he sneered, placing the glass down forcefully. His friends laughed, encouraging his behavior. A few people in the bar exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with what was happening. Some whispered to each other, but no one took action. It was the same story every time, bystanders who did not want to get involved, letting bullies like Greg continue their behavior without consequences. Jason observed everything. His expression calm but his eyes sharp. He had seen enough. He pushed his chair back slowly and stood up, his movements smooth and controlled. Without a word, he walked towards Greg's table, his presence alone causing a few people to take notice. As Jason approached, Greg was too busy laughing with his friends to notice him at first. But when Jason stopped right beside their table, the energy in the room shifted. The laughter died down, and Greg finally turned to look at him. His amused expression faded slightly as he took in Jason's confident stance and intense gaze. "Is there a problem here?" Jason asked, his voice steady but carrying undeniable authority. Greg scoffed, trying to play it cool. "Who are you, the fun police?" he said, crossing his arms. "We are just having a little fun. Right, Eric?" He nudged Eric roughly on the shoulder, making the smaller man flinch. Jason did not look away from Greg. "That does not look like fun to me," he said. "It looks like you are just trying to make yourself feel big by picking on someone smaller." Greg's friends shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift in mood. Some of them had been laughing along, but now they were not so sure. The presence of Jason, standing there so confidently, made them uneasy. Greg, however, was not about to back down. He leaned back in his chair and smirked. "And what if I am?" he challenged. "You going to do something about it?" Jason held his gaze, unshaken. He did not need to respond with words. His presence alone was enough to make it clear that he was not someone to mess with. The silence between them was heavy, and for the first time, Greg looked unsure. The bar had gone quiet now, everyone watching intently. The tension was at its peak. Would Greg push his luck further, or would he realize he was about to make a big mistake? Jason waited. His patience was limitless, but if Greg made one wrong move, he would be ready. The bar was completely silent. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The tension in the air was thick, as if the entire room was holding its breath. Greg's smirk faltered for just a second, a fleeting moment of uncertainty crossing his face. But he quickly masked it, straightening his shoulders and puffing out his chest. He refused to be intimidated, especially not in front of his friends. He had a reputation to uphold, and backing down now would shatter it. Greg leaned forward, his beer glass now forgotten on the table. He locked eyes with Jason, trying to match the unshaken confidence radiating from him. "Listen, buddy," he said, his voice lower but still laced with arrogance. "I do not know who you think you are, but you are messing with the wrong guy." His jaw tightened as he flexed his shoulders, deliberately making himself appear larger. "Maybe you should walk away before things get ugly." Jason did not react. He simply stood there, relaxed but commanding, his steady gaze locked onto Greg's. There was no aggression in his stance, no need for posturing, just quiet, unshakable confidence. It was unnerving, the kind of presence that could turn a whole room against someone without a single threat. "I am giving you a chance to walk away," Jason said, his voice even and measured. "You can stop this now, or you can push your luck. Your choice." Greg's friends, who had been laughing and egging him on moments ago, exchanged uncertain glances. They could feel it too. The shift in power, the realization that maybe, just maybe, Greg was out of his league. A few of them subtly leaned away from the table, no longer sure they wanted to be involved in whatever was coming next. But Greg was too stubborn, too wrapped up in his own pride to see the warning signs. He let out a scoff, shaking his head. "Oh, is that supposed to scare me?" He forced a chuckle, though it sounded slightly forced. "I do not back down from a challenge." Jason sighed, tilting his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "It is not about being scared," he said. "It is about knowing when to walk away." Greg's fists clenched at his sides. He could feel his pride stinging, the pressure of the moment bearing down on him. He had always been the one in control, the one people feared. But for the first time, he felt something foreign creeping in, doubt. And he hated it. "And what if I do not?" he challenged, his voice a little too loud, a little too aggressive. Jason took a slow step closer, closing the gap between them just enough to make Greg shift uncomfortably. The difference between them was stark. Jason did not need to puff out his chest or raise his voice. His presence alone was enough. "Then you will find out," Jason said simply. The entire bar was on edge now. The bartender, who had been polishing glasses behind the counter, subtly moved a few steps back, keeping a cautious eye on the confrontation. A couple of customers near the door whispered to each other, debating whether they should leave before things got out of hand. Eric, the man Greg had been bullying, stood frozen in place, his eyes darting between the two men. He had never seen someone stand up to Greg like this. Part of him wanted to speak up, to say something, but he was afraid of making things worse. Greg, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on him, suddenly stood up from his chair, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floor. He squared up to Jason, trying to make himself seem taller. "I do not know who you are, but you are really starting to annoy me," he said through gritted teeth, his voice dropping into a forced growl meant to sound threatening. Jason did not even blink. He just looked at Greg for a long moment before speaking again. Last chance, he said, his voice calm but firm, a final warning that hung in the air like a blade. Greg hesitated. He could feel the room turning against him. His friends were no longer cheering him on. In fact, a few of them had started to slide away from the table, clearly not wanting to be associated with what was about to happen. But Greg was too deep into this now. He could not back down without looking weak. His pride would not let him. He had bullied people his whole life. He was not about to let some stranger embarrass him in front of everyone. So, he made his choice. With a cocky grin, he balled up his fist and pulled his arm back, ready to swing. The entire bar gasped. A few people instinctively stepped back. The bartender ducked behind the counter, bracing for what was about to happen. Jason just sighed, as if he had seen this 100 times before. And then, in the blink of an eye, everything changed. Before Greg's punch could even come close, Jason moved. It was so fast that most people in the bar did not even see it happen. One moment Greg was swinging, and the next, his arm was twisted behind his back, his entire body bent forward, his face inches from the table. Jason had him completely immobilized with one fluid motion, his grip like iron. Greg let out a pained grunt, his cocky expression vanishing in an instant. His friends froze, eyes wide, unsure of whether they should step in or stay out of it. Jason leaned in slightly, his voice calm but commanding. "You made the wrong choice," he said, tightening his hold just enough to drive the point home. "But I will give you one more chance. Apologize. Now." Greg struggled, his face red with anger and humiliation. But the pain in his twisted arm told him there was no way out of this. Jason was in complete control. The room was dead silent, all eyes on them, waiting for Greg's response. And for the first time in his life, Greg knew he had lost. The moment Greg's fist started moving, Jason reacted with lightning speed. Before Greg could even complete his swing, Jason stepped to the side with perfect timing. His movements were smooth, controlled, almost effortless. Greg's punch met nothing but air, and the force of his own swing threw him off balance. Before he could recover, Jason expertly grabbed his wrist, twisted it slightly, and with a subtle motion, guided Greg's momentum downward. In less than a second, Greg found himself stumbling forward, completely off balance. Jason did not even need to use full force, just precision. Greg crashed onto the table behind him, sending beer glasses flying and chairs scraping against the wooden floor. The entire bar erupted in shocked gasps. Nobody had even seen Jason move, but in an instant, Greg was sprawled across the floor, groaning in frustration. Jason did not press the attack. He simply stood there, completely calm, looking down at Greg as if waiting for him to decide what he wanted to do next. Greg, embarrassed and furious, scrambled to his feet. His face was red with anger, his ego bruised more than anything else. "You think you are tough, huh?" he spat, wiping a bit of spilled beer from his sleeve. Jason remained silent. He did not need to prove anything. The way he had effortlessly handled Greg spoke for itself. But Greg was too stubborn to back down. He lunged again, this time attempting to grab Jason's shirt with both hands. Big mistake. With a swift, controlled movement, Jason sidestepped again and grabbed Greg's wrist. With one simple twist and a push, Greg was spun around and pinned against the bar counter. Jason applied just enough pressure to let Greg know that any more resistance would be pointless. The bartender took a nervous step back, his eyes wide. The entire bar was watching in stunned silence. Greg struggled for a moment but quickly realized he was completely at Jason's mercy. He gritted his teeth, his breathing heavy. His friends, who had been so confident before, were now frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Jason leaned in slightly and spoke in a quiet, firm voice. "It is over," he said. "Let it go." Greg's fists trembled, but he could feel the power in Jason's grip. He knew that if Jason wanted to, he could have ended this fight in a much worse way. And yet, Jason was giving him an out. Jason released Greg's wrist and took a step back. He was giving Greg a choice, to walk away or embarrass himself further. Greg turned around slowly, rubbing his wrist. His pride was shattered, and he knew it. He looked around at the crowd, at his friends who were no longer smirking, at the bartender who was shaking his head. He had lost, and there was no way to spin it. For a brief moment, it looked like Greg might try one last desperate move. But then, with a frustrated sigh, he clenched his jaw and muttered under his breath, "Forget this." He turned away, grabbed his jacket, and stormed toward the exit. His friends hesitated, but after exchanging glances, they quickly followed him out. The door slammed shut behind them. For a moment, the bar remained silent. Then, a slow clap started from one of the tables. It was Eric, the man Greg had been harassing earlier. He stood up and gave Jason an appreciative nod. "That," he said, shaking his head in disbelief, "was amazing." The rest of the bar erupted into applause and cheers. People patted Jason on the back, murmuring words of admiration. The bartender, still stunned, finally managed to speak. "I do not know who you are, man," he said, shaking his head, "but that was something else." Jason just offered a small smile. "Just here for a quiet drink," he said simply. The bartender chuckled and slid a fresh drink toward Jason. "This one is on the house," he said. Jason nodded in appreciation and took a seat, finally able to enjoy his evening. The bar slowly returned to normal, but the story of what had happened would be told for a long time. Jason Statham had not just stopped a bully, he had done it with precision, control, and a level of skill that left everyone in awe. And most importantly, he had done it without unnecessary violence. He had given Greg every chance to walk away, proving that true strength was not just about physical power, it was about knowing when to fight and when to show restraint. As the energy in the bar settled, Jason took a sip of his drink, his expression as calm as ever. The people around him were still talking about what had just happened, replaying the moment in their minds. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others laughed at how effortlessly Greg had been handled. Eric, the man Jason had defended, approached him with gratitude in his eyes. "I do not know how to thank you," he said, extending a hand. "That guy has been making trouble here for weeks, and nobody ever stood up to him." Jason shook his hand firmly. "No need," he replied. "People like him only push as far as they are allowed to." He needed to be stopped. The bartender leaned on the counter, still shaking his head in amazement. "I have seen my fair share of fights in this place," he said, "but I have never seen someone handle a situation like that. You could have knocked him out cold, but you did not." Jason smirked slightly. "A fight is not always about winning," he said. "Sometimes, it is about making sure nobody has to fight again." The bartender nodded, clearly impressed. "Well, if you ever need a place to grab a drink, you are always welcome here." At a table nearby, a few regulars continued discussing what had happened. "Did you see the way he moved?" one of them said. "That was not luck. He knew exactly what he was doing." Another nodded. "Yeah, he is definitely trained. The way he controlled the situation without even hurting the guy. That is a real skill." Meanwhile, outside the bar, Greg and his friends were still fuming. Greg rubbed his wrist, frustration boiling inside him. He had never been humiliated like that before, and worst of all, in front of a crowd. His friends, usually full of confidence, were quieter now, hesitant to say anything. One of them finally broke the silence. "Man, I think we should just forget about this." Greg exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Whatever," he muttered. But deep down, he knew he had been put in his place. He would not be coming back to that bar any time soon. Inside, Jason finished his drink, placed some cash on the counter, and stood up to leave. As he walked toward the door, Eric called out, "Hey, what is your name?" Jason turned slightly, gave a small nod, and with his signature cool demeanor, simply said, "Jason." With that, he stepped outside into the night, leaving behind a bar full of people who had just witnessed something they would never forget. Jason Statham had walked in for a quiet evening, but in the end, he had done what he does best. Stood up for what was right, without hesitation, without arrogance, and with a level of skill that left everyone speechless. The events of that night left a lasting impression on everyone who had witnessed them. Jason Statham did not just stop a bully, he showed what true strength looks like. It is not about showing off, seeking revenge, or proving dominance. It is about knowing when to step in, handling a situation with control, and leaving a lesson behind. Greg had spent his time in that bar pushing people around, but for the first time, He met someone who did not react with fear. Jason did not escalate the situation with unnecessary violence. Instead, he used skill, confidence, and control to put an end to the bullying without causing real harm. That is what made the moment so powerful. People often think strength is about being the loudest, the toughest, or the most aggressive person in the room. But Jason proved that real strength is quiet, controlled, and purposeful. It is not about hurting others. It is about standing up when it matters, protecting those who need help, and knowing when to walk away. Eric, the man Jason had defended, would never forget that lesson. The bartender, the regulars, and even Greg's friends saw something they had never seen before. Someone who could take complete control of a situation without being reckless or cruel. That kind of strength is rare, and it is something everyone can learn from. As Jason walked out into the night, the bar was left buzzing with conversation. Some people were still in shock, while others laughed at how effortlessly Greg had been put in his place. But beneath all of that, there was a deeper lesson. Respect is something that is earned, not taken. Arrogance and intimidation might work for a while, but in the end, true strength will always win. This story serves as a reminder for everyone. Do not let bullies control the room. Stand your ground when necessary, but always keep your composure. Strength is not about overpowering others. It is about knowing when to step in, when to speak up, and when to walk away. And if there is anyone who embodies that lesson perfectly, it is Jason Statham.